Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is one of the Food Foundation's Quick Bites episodes when we look into a topical news event around food policy and talk to somebody that can shed light on the challenge that we're thinking about. And you'll all know that food prices is really one of the top concerns at the moment for both the government and hugely prominent in the media debate. And so I'm really, really delighted today to have Dr. Joseph Glauber with me. Joe is a research fellow emeritus at the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is a global food policy leading institute based in Washington, D.C. And Joe also used to be the chief economist at the US Department of Agriculture, so has got huge experience that we're able to draw on today thinking about food price volatility. And we want to get into really what it is, understanding a little bit more about what is driving food price inflation here in the UK now, but what is likely to come. And also think about some of the policy choices which governments are facing around the world in this area, and thinking a little bit about how they're playing through here in the UK as well. So thank you so much for joining us,
Yeah,
Joe. Great to have you with us. So let's start by talking a little bit about your assessment at the moment of the impact of the war in the Middle East on food prices specifically. Explain a bit about how that connection between the war and ultimately how that flows through to food prices it really works.
yeah, sure. No, and thanks so much for the invitation to be on the program, first of all. But insofar as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz it's created some very big problems in the energy markets for sure. And we know that, with oil prices reaching well over $100 a barrel. But also fertilizer markets. It's become an increasingly important region for fertilizer production. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it didn't produce very much fertilizer, but now it does. There are actually some immediate food concerns, largely within those countries within the Gulf who are importing, and they import a lot of a high percentage of their food products. I think those have largely been being met, although Iran is having very, very high inflation rates right now, and I think there's stresses in Iraq as well. But the real consequences, the immediate consequences, are on the energy front, and I think there we've seen obviously fuel prices go up. That means shipping costs have increased. And then the bigger, longer term concern, I think, is on fertilizer. And fertilizer takes, people use natural gas to produce nitrogen fertilizers. The the Gulf region exports a lot of liquefied natural gas to countries like India, who then turn that liquefied natural gas into nitrogen fertilizer. Um, those those supplies, and those are quite large. You're talking 35-40% of nitrogen produced in the world comes out of the Gulf. For the time being, that is stopped, a pretty hard stop. I think there is some oil that's been transported through the Gulf, over the last few weeks, a little bit, but not much in terms of fertilizer. A little bit's been going over land, but it's very difficult to ship. It's not set up with alternative pipelines and other things that we see with the energy side. I think for the short term, there's probably the not nearly as big effect as you might think, just in the sense that a lot of particularly farmers in the northern hemisphere have bought fertilizer. A lot had bought prior to the spring. That's a typical buying pattern. I think in the US, there's been estimates of anywhere from 70-75% of producers had bought fertilizer. But those who haven't are facing very, very high costs. And so the question for those producers will be what crops do they plant? Should they move to a crop that's less nitrogen intensive, for example? Or do they just apply less nitrogen? I think that's the immediate concern. But I think largely the northern hemisphere is pretty well supplied, and I would include in that the first rice crop of India, other areas around the world, um, where don't expect large production issues. Where I do get worried is the longer this goes on, that means Southern Hemisphere production. Brazil's a very large importer of fertilizer. They typically import fertilizer in the last portion of the year, in particular the last quarter of the year for their nitrogen needs. They will be facing, the longer this goes on, they will be facing very high costs. And so the question is, will that affect production in places like Brazil? Will that affect production of second season, third season rice in a lot of Southeast Asia? And that's sort of the longer term concerns. We had very high prices in 2022, record high prices, higher prices than we see now for fertilizers. And we did see a little bit of drop off in input use. But remember that in 2022, as distinct from now, is we had high grain prices as well. So the profit margins were there for producers. And so producers paid the high price for fertilizer because they could get high prices for wheat or maize or other crops they were growing. This time around, prices are much more depressed. So it's unclear how that will affect application rates and things like that over the longer run. And then ultimately, how does that affect yields? And yes, obviously, fertilizer is very important for crop production. But we also know that in some areas of the world, farmers over-fertilize, they use too much fertilizer. Higher prices may make see those applications drop, but not a commensurate drop in yields. They'll use fertilizer more efficiently, and that's a good thing in one sense. So let me stop there.
Yeah, interesting. Let's just unpack some of that. So the point about Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere, is really interesting. And this point about the sort of calculus changing for farmers. I mean, I think we're concerned about we're going to hit the new season in the autumn here in the UK. And as you say, unlike the Ukraine crisis, where farmers were thinking, well, high fertilizer price, also high wheat price, this works. I can afford to take the hit in the input cost. That calculus is different. But of course, if ultimately it does start to affect yields and supply, that changes again, right? So could you just explain a little bit about why the context in terms of the big commodity prices at the moment, why they're not as high, why the market, we've got a little bit more, I don't know if the right word is loose, it's not as tight, the market, as it has been.
No, that's exactly right. Back in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, we saw an immediate hike in wheat prices and in maize prices and other commodity prices. Prices had already been high at the time, so global stock levels had been drawn down. Some of that because of coming out of COVID, there was this big demand push, and you saw a big recovery in places like China, where they had problems with their hog population with animal diseases. They changed the way they were producing hogs. They moved much more towards feeding hogs, soybean meal and maize. And those prices for those commodities really started reflecting that big increase in demand. And then on top of that, you had this problem in the Black Sea. Those demand factors aren't present right now. There's one exception. We do see, because of high oil prices, we do see an increase in biodiesel use around the world. So vegetable oil prices, which are a feedstock for biodiesel production, they've gone up. They're up about 10%. The other commodities are very, very flat. And I think that one is that the market is unsure how long the current crisis is going to last. I think if you look at the oil markets, certainly if you try to read what they're trying to say is it looks like they're expecting that we will get this resolved sometime this year, that commodities will, that oil will begin to flow again. And I think that's also kind of makes its way into the commodity markets, where again, what I'm saying is the Northern Hemisphere right now, the main crops that are going to be coming off from that were planted last fall or this spring likely will be not affected very much by the current problem. The real problem starts to emerge, I think, afterwards. So really a 2027 problem more than a 2026 problem. And I think the markets are just saying, well, we'll make that adjustment if we see this thing lingering into late 2026. I think if this continues to be a problem through the summer, I think you'll begin to see some of the commodity prices go up. Now, with that all said, there's a lot of other things going on in the world. We have a lot of dryness in the U.S. for wheat. The wheat production looks not very good this year. The crop conditions are pretty poor, but overall global wheat stocks are quite large. So I think the market is kind of shrugging that off as well. But all these things can turn pretty quickly if there's a drought somewhere. If Europe were to have a drought, or if Black Sea region, or turning to the southern hemisphere, some problem there. We have an El Nino event likely to occur in the second half of this year. It looks to be a very strong probability of a strong El Nino event. That does tend to be correlated with negative rice yields in Southeast Asia. We didn't see much problems in 2023 with the El Nino that we had then, but that could happen, and that's obviously that's part of agriculture, and particularly with climate change, weather variability is something that agriculture has to deal with all the time. But you layer on top of that the potential there of also fertilizer issues, then there could be some potential problems. But right now the market's expecting that given all what they see in terms of again, with the expectation that this crisis in the Gulf won't last, through the end of the year. But again, that could change.
Yeah. A lot of uncertainty. Just going back to your point about biofuels, which is really interesting. And do you expect, because that in the past, I remember in
2007, 8.
That's right. 2008. I was getting the wrong decade.
That probably was the first really big biofuel boom. That was largely in the US with ethanol, and ethanol production just increased dramatically. Again, all due to mandates, that were Congress was passing, and the fact that the gasoline, the petrol supply in the US was going. I don't need to get into the technical details, but there was a reason why ethanol was important for the gasoline supply, to provide oxygenates to the fuel system. So the industry immediately kind of built out the capacity for 15 billion gallons of ethanol production, and that meant that I am sorry with the bushels versus tons, but about 1 billion bushels of corn each year was going in additional. Going into ethanol production over a very short period of time. And it was very prescribed. So you could, I was at USDA at the Department of Agriculture at the time, and we were doing our forecasts. And our forecasts were about as good as any forecast. I mean, I don't think I've seen forecasts that accurate, because they were all done it was all mandates, right? So you could say, oh, next year we're going to have another billion in. So what's going to be the effect of that on market prices? And that really drove, maize prices in particular, but all the other crops came up as accordingly. And that really was, we haven't fallen back to levels pre-2007. I mean, that really was a big push to a new thing. And it's switched from ethanol more to biodiesel now, and you have several countries in the world that are producing a lot of biodiesel. U.S. over 50% of its vegetable oil or its soybean oil production in the US goes to biodiesel. I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah,
Over
yeah.
half is going to an industrial use. And so,
And in the absence of, policy mandates, etc., is it likely that that switch starts to happen just by market economics, where
uh,
actually the cost
with
of
ethanol,
fuel's
with
so
ethanol,
high?
yeah, with ethanol, yes, or with
Okay.
ethanol potentially. Ethanol is very competitive, and again, there are some features of ethanol as an oxygenate, as an additive to the fuel supply that at least petrol manufacturers in the U.S. have been evolved and are using it. For biodiesel, it's expensive. I mean, it's just so much more expensive than petroleum-based fuels.
Yeah.
You
Okay.
have to either subsidize it or mandate its consumption. In the US, we do both. So we have seen this big increase. But if you were to, I mean, a good, you could get rid of the ethanol mandates in the US overnight, and I don't think you would see much change. You wouldn't see any growth, I don't think. But to certainly see 10% of the fuel supply being supplied by ethanol, that I think would be maintained. With biodiesel, I think it's very questionable. There are some what is driving biodiesel in the US are both these mandates through the federal renewable fuel standard, but also through state level things like the low carbon fuel standard in California. So,
Okay.
yeah, and as you're probably well aware or have covered in some of your other um, programs, there's controversy over the carbon accounting on these
Mm,
fuels, whether or not these things
yeah.
are big savers or not in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's interesting just insofar as how countries differ in terms of how they do the accounting on that. And in some places, this looks like a great fuel. In other cases, it doesn't because of the accounting. But
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So let's move on a little bit to the sort of question about what happens when energy prices go up and how they flow through to food prices. So we've had a report published this week by the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit here in the UK, which they've called Rockets and Feathers, to try and capture their key finding when they look at food prices, that food prices can go up very sharply when there's a shock, whether it's an energy shock or a supply shock, because we saw both following the Ukraine crisis. And they're very, very slow to come down, if at all. And I'm interested to hear your sort of observations as to how these costs get baked uh, in the system that we
yeah,
have, the way it's organized at the moment.
yeah, no, no, it's a great topic. And I think what's difficult oftentimes for policymakers to understand and others is just, all of the costs that get embodied in retail food, right? So we tend to look at maize prices or wheat prices or even beef prices, or you think, well, they're going down. Shouldn't we see food inflation fall? And yet, if you look at how much of the costs occur post-farm gate, it's enormous. It's 85% in the US. I mean, and I suspect UK is very, very similar given the amount of, I mean, the classic example we use or I use in the US is the price of wheat and the price of bread. I think the cost of wheat in a loaf of bread in the US is roughly 5%. 5%. So
Yeah.
you can double that price of wheat and have at least in theory, fairly small impact on the price of bread because it has to move from the farm to a mill to get made into flour, to move to a bakery to be made into bread. There's a lot of energy, there's a lot of labor, there's a lot of other transformation costs that are quite literally baked into those costs. And so by the time it gets to the retail poor shelf, it's that cost is quite high, and a lot of those costs don't go down. I mean, what we did see in 2023, and again, UK certainly saw its share of food inflation. The US did as well. Almost every country around the world saw enormous, I won't say historically high food inflation levels, but very high food inflation
We had the
levels
highest in
relative.
40
Yes,
years in the
since yeah,
UK.
that's
So,
right. Since the late 70s, that was pretty typical. A lot of that was driven, by the sort of increase in the economy post COVID and post lockdowns as our economies came out of a lockdown and big demand. We had in the U.S. we had problems trying to get labor back into places like restaurants and other things. Just people weren't willing to be exposed or were worried about that.
mhm,
And so you saw labor costs in, say, retail restaurants and other places or grocery stores really increase over that period. Those end up, those don't go down. So you
mhm,
do get those costs kind of in there. Energy costs, obviously, they can go up and go down, but energy enters at almost every phase of the marketing chain. And so, you increase, you see a big long-term increase in things like oil prices. They will make their way through the economy, not just food, but other things as well. And that does tend to have an impact. I mean, if you look at individual food prices, there's a lot of volatility. I look at eggs in the US. We had egg prices up. Uh, this was a big thing during the presidential campaign that egg prices were 40%. Those were largely fundamentals in the egg market. We had this avian influenza, this bird flu that had killed a lot of the flocks, and so we had a short supply of eggs. Um, but those things have all come back. The egg prices are now down 30%. But what I think is harder is that food inflation, while it had come down from those high 10% levels that we saw in 23, 24, and went down to, 1% or 2% just last year, they still didn't decline. They didn't go back down below what they were in 23. And I think
no,
that's the sticker shock that most consumers look at and say, my grocery bill has gone up so much over the last 5 years. And in a normal period, they kind of go up. Individual commodities will go up and down, but this has been a sustained increase. And I think it's kind of what we saw in the late 70s, early 80s. All of a sudden, by the mid 80s, you had forgotten the fact that prices were as low as they were in the late 70s before the inflation hit in the late 70s. It was just a new level. And I think that's sort of where we are with some of this in terms of food inflation. Again,
yeah,
less because of the underlying commodities, because commodities, if you adjust commodity prices for inflation, a lot of those food prices, have been falling, or commodity prices have been falling in real terms, adjusted for inflation, for the last 60, 70 years. They began to flatten out some, but some of that's just due to technology and other things. But the food prices, they go up 2 to 3% per year. And then unfortunately, in periods like this where you see higher,
mm. Yeah. So I mean, just to give a few of the UK stats for the listeners, we track a basic basket of goods that we've been tracking now for the last 4 years. And we have two baskets, one for a man and one for a woman, just because of different calorie levels. And those increases have gone between 30 and 38% increase in the price over that period. We've also had some other analysis, which has been recently published also by ECIU, showing that if we take prices since sort of the eve of the cost of living crisis, as we call it here in the UK, so mid 2021, and add on what is forecast by the Food and Drink Federation to happen by the end of this year, we're looking at over that period a 50% increase
mm,
in prices over that period. And I think some of the other points which they've made in their report have been around, as you say, there's sort of all of the different steps, each having their own inflationary elements that they're dealing with, and some of those contracts being set for longer. You might be negotiating a new energy price, hedging that, and even if energy prices come down, it might remain higher. You've got all these different steps in the system which create lags, but also lock in for longer periods but those higher prices. And I think the other point that they make quite powerfully is around this point about margin, and that while margins might be relatively small for retailers, investors want, in periods of inflation, for margin to be protected, and that's often a percentage margin. And so while prices go up, margins might stay the same, but the amount of revenue that generates is obviously significantly higher, given it's a percentage. And again, this sort of, I suppose, locking in essentially those higher prices as it happens over time, you can see how it creates the system where that becomes perpetuated. Okay, let's just move briefly on to government responses. We've only got a couple of minutes, but keen to hear your views on where you think governments are most effective in helping consumers to deal with this, the sorts of policies that they effectively deploy.
Yeah, no, to me, the most critical probably is, dealing with the social safety net. And so, for affluent households, food's a pretty small portion of their overall expenditures. And we may grouse about the high price of food, but we still purchase it. But if you're a poorer household, that really is such a big portion of your overall food, of your overall household expenditures. And I think that's something that governments need to take care of, for those who can't afford it. Unfortunately, that's a luxury developed countries have. We are fortunate to have. With poorer countries, I think that's much more difficult. And in poorer countries, for less developed countries, they do see higher commodity. A larger share of their food costs are the commodity price itself and fuel
Yeah.
prices. So if you're in a small town up country in Kenya or something, you may be paying a lot more just by virtue of the fact that whoever's selling those goods are baking in all these higher fuel costs and other things. It's just, those are tough things. So I think primarily I view it as an income issue. What I don't like to see are governments moving in the markets themselves and trying to cap prices or put on export restrictions or things because those tend to backfire in pretty with some oftentimes bad unintended consequences where with food caps and other things, you just see those products go off the shelf, and in some countries that creates incentives for black markets and other sorts of things. And with export restrictions, and which we see with a lot of countries on the commodity side. So during the war in Ukraine, we saw some countries saying, well, okay, we're just not going to export wheat because we need to keep the wheat here. We see that with fertilizer right now, with countries like China saying we're not going to export those fertilizers.
Yeah.
That's great for domestic producers, obviously, or domestic consumers in the case of wheat. But unfortunately, all that volatility and high prices are exported to the rest of the world. And so, again, for the developed countries, not as big an issue, but for developing countries, poor developing countries, they get really hurt by that a lot.
Joe, thank you so much. It's a stark reminder, really, of how we sit in the global context here in the UK. It flows through to our shopping baskets, but we've also got to be mindful of what's happening in countries which are less fortunate than us in terms of how they're exposed to this. But thank you for your time. Thank you to everybody for listening. Please do sign up to the newsletter and to the podcast, because that's where you'll hear about all the latest conversations like this that we're having. And there'll be more episodes on food prices as we bring in experts from around the world to discuss this very challenging issue which we're grappling with here in the UK. So thanks for joining me again, Joe, and see you all again soon.
Thanks.